Alrighty, welcome back for part 2 of chapter 21. Let me go ahead and share. There we go. So this section is the rise of totalitarian dictatorships. This starts on page 472 in your book. Some of the things that we'll be talking about are what is totalitarianism, and what are some of those common characteristics that totalitarian states share with each other. Who were the major players or individuals in this time period with the rise of totalitarianism. And then getting into some stuff tomorrow where we're looking at different types of government that practice this kind of mindset. So let's dive on in and kind of figure out what does this mean. All right, so characteristics of totalitarian states. Basically, a totalitarian state is the type, let's move this a little bit, type of dictatorship that has total control over all aspects of life and any opposition to that. So they use propaganda to promote their ideas and programs. Basically, posters, different materials, methods of indoctrinating people into their type of thinking. They use efficient secret police to arrest or assassinate people that oppose the state and their policies. And that sounds a little scary to me. Number 3, they emphasize the goals of the state rather than individual rights or concerns. So my seniors have been studying the Bill of Rights lately, and this would not be a big part of a totalitarian state. Okay, you focus on what is best for the country rather than what is best for individual people. All right, some other characteristics. Pardon me. State control of every aspect of life. So the government controls politics, they control the economy, they control culture and education and religion. They really have tight control over your life. So what you're taught in school, over what you see on TV, over what you can access on the internet, over where you can go to church or if churches are even allowed. Political parties, do you have a choice when you vote? Is there just one political party, or can you choose between different candidates? So state control over every aspect of life is a really big part of a totalitarian government. Another characteristic is the government is maintained by force and isn't really accountable to the people for their actions. Again, that sounds a little scary to me, at least from my mindset of growing up here in a country that focuses so much on freedom and liberty. Number 6, having a one-party political system led by a powerful dictator. So we see all across Europe, in both established countries as well as newly created countries, we see a rise of dictators coming to power in this time between World War I and World War II. So you have like Antonio de Oliveira Salazar in Portugal. You have a situation in Spain where there's a bloody civil war and Francisco Franco gains control. You have a situation in Turkey where there is Mustafa Kemal setting himself up as a dictator. So this is widespread throughout Europe. All right, let's switch gears to Russia, right, and talking about what was going on during this time period. So Tsarist Russia basically had collapsed, right? You have the reforms of Tsar Alexander II coming to an end. He was assassinated back in 1881, so his successor was Alexander III, and Alexander III attempts to suppress new and revolutionary ideas. Okay? He ordered the state police and courts to really intensify their efforts. He demanded censorship of the press. He persecuted minority groups. For example, many Jews that were living in Russia were either killed during these pogroms or they fled before they were killed, many of them ending up in other parts of Europe. Okay? So under Nicholas II, okay, which was Alexander III's son, and you can see Nicholas on the far right of the screen right here, when he was much younger. But Nicholas II basically took over control, and during his reign, popular discontent really exploded, and we have a lot of revolutionary activity where radicals and liberals organize themselves into political parties. You have people fleeing the country, but basically you have some new groups being created. So you have a group known as the Bolsheviks that are kind of breaking away from the larger, more moderate group called the Mensheviks. So the Bolsheviks advocated change through violence, where the Mensheviks wanted change through more peaceful measures. All right, so basically this prelude to revolution. I'm on page 473, by the way. Okay. So you have Nicholas II, who's trying to maintain authority, but there's some crazy stuff that happens during the Russo-Japanese War that really brings a lot of this discontent to the surface. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. You also have a situation known as Bloody Sunday, where soldiers killed unarmed workers who were protesting. This happened in 1905. There were about 2,000 men, women, and children that were protesting and kind of marching toward the palace. They had a petition calling for Nicholas II to improve the workers' life, kind of wanting this National Assembly to convene and have an election where people could actually vote. But most of these marchers never actually saw the Tsar, and instead these soldiers met the marchers and opened fire, killing tons and tons of people and wounding quite a few more. So the events of this day became known as Bloody Sunday, and a lot of the Russians really turned away from the Tsar at that point. They began to look elsewhere for an answer to their suffering. So the Tsar basically, he promised to create a national assembly known as the Duma, and the members of the Duma would be elected by the people. So that was kind of his way of trying to pacify them and keep them from rising up again. So on the outbreak of revolution, there's this gentleman in the picture. You might have heard of him before, Rasputin. He became an advisor to the royal family. Basically, I don't want to get there quite yet. Basically, he was in a situation with the son of the Tsar who had some sort of blood disorder, and basically it appeared that Rasputin had somehow healed this boy of his disorder, and so he really gained the favor of the Empress, who listened to him and all of his kind of crazy advice. But really he was plotting and kind of manipulating the situation, and basically making the situation worse for that leading family of Russia. So revolution broke out in March of 1917. Nicholas II basically abdicated his position, really didn't have much of a choice, and a guy by the name of Alexander Kerensky tried to restore order and really couldn't. The Bolsheviks were basically well organized and opposing his government. They wanted an immediate end to this conflict, and they wanted to implement some pretty radical social reforms. So the Bolsheviks basically take control of this revolution. Their leader is a guy by the name of Nikolai Lenin, and basically they sign a treaty, Brest-Litovsk, which I'm probably not saying that right, but basically they leave the war at the time. I remember that World War I is kind of going on in the background of all of this. So Russia leaves the war and really upsets the Allies, who thought that they could rely on them. Within the country of Russia, a civil war breaks out. A guy by the name of Trotsky is leading the Red Army against the White Army, who are still loyal to the Allies. And throughout the Civil War, Basically, the Red Army wins, and Russia then becomes a communist state after all of this. Okay? And they kind of create their own name there, the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. Okay? They move the capital from St. Petersburg back to Moscow. So there's a lot of history on this slide, and I'm just giving you a brief glimpse at this, but we could talk about this quite a bit more. So there's a lot of details that I'm kind of skimming over. All right, so after the death of Lenin in 1924, again, we have the creation of the official name of the USSR, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. All right, so the leader after Lenin's death is a guy by the name of Joseph Stalin. And he had a plan. He called it his 5-year plan, where he was going to build up industrial production and collectivize agriculture and basically bring a lot of these industries under government control. Basically controlling agriculture and kind of pushing the country toward this idea of socialism, where the government had production goals for each industry of how much they needed to produce. And some of the heavy industries were able to meet the government's demands, but many other industries couldn't. And so products were really in short supply. There was a lot of mismanagement of government programs, and really kind of the economy was not doing so great. Okay, so wrapping things up with this reign of terror, this comes from page 478 in your book. Stalin instituted purges of basically people that opposed him, who weren't loyal to his regime. So he basically got rid of 800,000 of his own party members. They were murdered. Many of them were the ruling elite. Even the military suffered, as Stalin ordered the execution of a lot of the army's top leaders and other officials. And so there was a lot of fear created during this time. Okay? Reign of Terror is a really good name. So thousands of churches and schools were forced to close. Many pastors and priests were killed. It was just kind of a frightening time for a lot of people. When it came to foreign policy, Stalin created something called the Comintern, which was the Communist International, basically trying to support communist countries, creating communist countries in other parts of the world, and kind of stirring up discontent and trying to create revolutions, just like what had happened in Russia. So that's a weird place to stop for today, but that's where we're going to stop. We'll pick up tomorrow talking about Italy and Germany and what was going on in that part of the world. Talk to you later.